start this session. And this event has been organized by the Canadian Council for Refugees, the Southern Ontario Sanctuary Coalition, Amnesty International, and the Canadian Association for Refugee Lawyers. The theme for tonight is going to be the strategies for opposing Bill C-31, and I want to introduce you our panelists. On my left, Mev Rashid, that is a family doctor and is the director of the Crossroads Clinic of Women's College Hospital and a big activist to oppose on the cutoff of the interim federal health program. And he had been leading with other doctors every time to shame the government since the cuts have been happening. And he will come and talk to us. Mev. On my right, Peter Scholler, that we know him that he is an expert and is excellent, the best person who can do pickles here in Canada. And also, he had been challenging Francisco all the time to have a good soccer game. Maybe you can invite Mr. Jason Kelly. But seriously, he is a former chair of the Immigration and Refugee Board and is the director of the Refugee Reform from the University of Ottawa, and he is one of the activists and excellent experts on the refugee process as a lawyer. Peter? And at the end of my right hand, a wonderful woman that is Mary Jo Lady, who is the founder of Romero House, one of the refugee houses that have been accommodated a lot of refugees' families, and also a big advocate with the sanctuary. And Mary Jo, thank you for being here, and she has been writing many books, and she has been one of the examples as a woman fighting for refugees. How we are going to do is that we will have the presentations on the strategies how we can oppose with the Bill C-31. We are going to start with Peter Scholler, that he will give us an overview and also some solutions. Then we will continue with Mev, that he will explain us how have been with the advocacy with the interim federal health program problems. And Mary Jo, she will give us the wrap-up and her wisdom, how we can continue with this struggle. They will speak for 20 minutes each, and then we will come with the questions. Peter?
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here this evening, particularly with the honors that were accorded towards Fred this evening. First of all, I should let you know that I'm operating under two afflictions. The first one is that I managed to forget my speaking notes at the hotel. It's happened before. But the second one, you should know I'm suffering under a recently diagnosed psychological condition. And I feel I should share it with you. It is a condition that is known as Kennyism. Don't laugh. It's very painful. I have sudden attacks when whatever anyone's saying seems fraudulent and bogus. But this is a very serious condition. It can be very confusing. As a matter of fact, it's so confusing that I've asked some of my close colleagues this evening, who are some of the best refugee lawyers, smartest refugee lawyers in the country. They're with us today. There's Andrew Brower, there's Carol DeHaan, there's Aviva Bossman, I think Hillary Cameron is here, Michael Bossman is going to be here. They're here to help me when I get confused. And I can assure you, if you have any questions afterwards, don't ask me, ask them, but they're going to be glad to answer those questions. The other thing about the condition, at least It's only a moderate condition. It's not as bad as it could be. In the advanced form, it's, at least I know I'm confused, and I realize sometimes that in actuality these people are not bogus. But in the advanced condition, I think you can know some of the people in Canada who suffer from it. They're absolutely convinced that their perception of who's fraudulent, they're absolutely fraudulent. So they have a far more serious problem than I do. In any event, they've asked me to start off to talk about Bill C-31 in terms of what are the strategies and particularly the legal solutions. What I'm going to very briefly do is refer to some of the principal problems with Bill C-31, but I am making the assumption that a lot of you already have a general sense of the Act itself. But there's no doubt in terms of Bill C-31, this is a sea change. We're going in a very different direction where it's going to do significant damage to refugees and in very significant ways has reduced the way in which they can make refugee claims here in Canada. Essentially, I'm only going to talk about some of the broad strokes issues, but the main one, if you really boil it down, it's this, that refugees will really not have, too many refugees, claimants will not have a fair opportunity to tell their story. And two of the principal ways in which that happens is, first of all, the system is just too fast. It's too fast in all kinds of ways, and I'll talk about that. And the second one is, it creates different classes of refugees, and that affects some of those classes in terms of they get even less procedure, and in other ways they're actually even directly harmed, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In terms of the legal solutions, before I talk about that, it's really talking about legal strategies rather than solutions, because some of this stuff, there aren't particularly good solutions. But I think it's important to think about this if I'm talking about the legal strategies. What we're talking about here, particularly with the speed of the process, it's a kind of legal machine. It's not just a matter of challenging law, because you've got the laws that are created by Parliament that's somewhat accountable in public, but you've also got regulations that are part of it, which are created by the Cabinet, and even though they're publicly published, there's not as much accountability on that. You also have rules that have been created by the Immigration and Refugee Board. Again, there's publication and some accountability. And down below that, you've got ministers' directives that are going to happen. Down below that, you've got various departmental directives that are going to happen. And all these are bits and parcels of this machine that is going to start rolling in terms of refugee claims. And it's really not going to slow down very much when a particular refugee really cannot respond to the demands of the system. So I think in terms of law, it's worth thinking about that. In terms of legal strategies itself, I think that there are three strategies. And so I'm first going to talk about the speed of the machine, how fast it goes. And it happens at every level. At the level of that there's only going to be 15 days to provide a written explanation. There's only going to be 30 or 60 days before they have to get the evidence and be in the hearing. We know that means that lots of people are not going to be represented by counsel, that legal aid agencies can't respond to that. It's going to put pressure on a lot of players in the system. It's not just claimants, it's not just lawyers, it's not just the Immigration and Refugee Board, it's all the assistance agencies as well, it's the medical profession that are going to respond, that are expected to produce medical or psychological reports. Everybody's going to be subjected to the pressures of a system that is just going too fast. In terms of legal strategies, I have divided them into three categories. The first one actually may surprise you a little bit, because the first legal strategy, if there are all these expectations that refugees cannot respond to, the first strategy is one of compliance, finding ways to meet unreasonable expectations of the system. Why I included that is partially because I was very struck today at the CCR meeting, the discussions of the various ways in which understanding that there's not enough time to get lawyers, there are not enough lawyers or legal advisors available, who else can do it? Who else can help out? Who else can get training sufficient to at least explain, not to represent them before the board, but even to make the efforts to try and tell them what kind of evidence they need to get, or try and tell them how to fill out this basis of claim form that has to be just the most unfathomable mystery to so many of the people that have to fill it out. So the compliance that happens in all the way, and I was just thinking tonight, it's almost like a flood where people are just coming out of their houses and using shovels or sandbags, various ways to help people when the system has been created in a way that there's just not enough resources to respond to the expectations, the speed it's going to happen. So it's worth thinking about that, is that's actually a legal strategy. And certainly from the point of view of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, and I'm on their executive, one of the ways what we're thinking of is ways to provide legal tools, provide the shovels and the sandbags for others to use them to assist refugees. So it's worth thinking about that as a strategy. The second legal strategy, and this is where the lawyers kind of straighten their belts and say, okay, let's get down to it, let's go fight. The second way is in terms of individual cases. So legal representatives, particularly lawyers representing claimants, will be able to, we have tools that we use. We call them natural justice. We call them the duty to act fairly. We have these kinds of tools that are established in law that we can say it is unreasonable and unfair to expect this person to provide you with a psychiatric report in 30 days. They've made their efforts to obtain it, they haven't made it, and it's unreasonable for you and unfair to make a decision on this case because this case turns on that psychological report. So those kinds of tools to win some of the cases, and undoubtedly there'll be a fair amount of success. The third way is, if you will, to challenge the machine itself, the institutional structure of it. So this is when we start talking about the Charter of Rights, and in particular we'll be talking about Section 7 of the rights, and this is the one where there's a right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and not to be deprived thereof, except within the principles of fundamental justice. So this is where we argue fundamental justice, and we say it's not that my client is actually not getting a fair hearing. The way in which you've designed this system, too many people are not getting a fair hearing. They cannot respond to it. And this is where I'm referring to lots of lawyers will be doing this, but certainly the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers will be very concerned to develop briefs in advance and develop coherent legal arguments that will proceed through the courts to challenge major parts of the machine. I kind of like calling it the machine. It sounds good. In any event, to do that, though, there's some downsides to all of those strategies. In terms of the first one, compliance, a lot of the time it's not going to work. Or you're going to partly train a community worker who will partly understand the law, give some assistance, it will be insufficient, and a case that should be validly accepted won't be accepted. There will be lots of those. In terms of the individual efforts, even if they're good efforts, they won't always succeed, and it doesn't affect the system. In terms of the strategy of challenging it from a constitutional point of view, the law is slow. It's always been slow, and while it follows its way through the courts, undoubtedly, I think, for these kinds of fundamental changes, it will go to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, a lot of people will be in prison who shouldn't be in prison. A lot of claims will be refused because of the speed of the system, because people didn't listen along the way. So that's the downside of those three strategies. So they all work, but they're not, none of them are going to be fully effective. Let me switch to the other central problem I mentioned, and that is the classification of refugees into different classes. And I want to really speak about two. First are the designated countries of origin. So this is where the minister, on a relatively arbitrary basis, can designate certain countries. And the consequence of that from a designated country of origin is, instead of 60 days, which is in many cases insufficient to get the evidence for the hearing, you're going to have 30 days. They're going to have 30 days with a 10-day disclosure rule, so it's 20 days. So it's incredibly small amount of time. So you're going to have more claimants within that category who will have greater struggles to try and prove their claim. And once again, you can be from a DCO country, but you can still, at the same time, be a vulnerable claimant, for example, where you need a psychological report, not just to show that you've been injured or damaged in some way, but you don't even have the full capacity to testify before the hearing. And within 30 days, you're still going to have to appear before that hearing. And if you're fortunate with a strong lawyer and with a respectable, decent member, they may grant an adjournment until that psychological report. At this point, we have no assurance whether that's going to happen or not. We do know we've received repeated messages from the board that when the machine is going, the expectation will always be to complete the hearing as soon as possible in the same day. They don't want the machine to stop. So it's going to take a lot of very good cogent arguments to persuade them otherwise. The other thing, if you're from a DCO country, having had only 30 days to prove your claim in terms of 60 makes complete sense, then you wouldn't get an appeal. And that's the secondary effect of that. And the third effect is if you go seek judicial review because you don't have an appeal, your removal from the country is not automatically stayed while you're trying to make that judicial review. So you now maybe have a lawyer, maybe don't have a lawyer, you've only been in the country 30 days, you haven't worked, you've got no money. We've had indications from the legal aid societies that the classifications who will be least likely to receive legal aid certificates will be the DCO countries. So for all of that, even the access to the courts is going to be very limited. So that's obviously a problem in a large way. Again, it'll be the same. Compliance isn't going to work very well with this category. Almost certainly there's going to be much more effort on the third strategy of challenging this from a constitutional basis, particularly Section 7, also Section 15. The last one is the designated foreign nationals. So this is supposedly the group tourist plans that arrive, the refugee tourist plans who arrive in a group. Therefore, you should be treated differently. And of course, the way in which you should be treated differently is, first of all, you're mandatorily put in prison if you're over 15 years of age. Because the government backed off from what they wanted to pass the last minute, you're only put in prison for 2 weeks. Then there will be a review. And at that point, you can be released. But if you don't have identity documents, there's a fairly good chance you're still going to be in prison. That second, or you continue in prison for a mandatory period of 6 months. And I use the word prison because Jason Kenney talks about detention as though it's a YMCA camp. He's even talked about, well, at least they're going to get a hot meal and a warm bed. But in actuality, we're talking about, if there's any significant number of people, we're talking about provincial prisons, what are called medium security provincial prisons, mixed in with criminal populations. And it will be from that position that they will then have to prove their refugee claim. And once again, since they're proving it in more difficult circumstances, well, of course, they won't have an appeal either, and they also won't have any assurance they can remain in the country when they start their judicial review unless they persuade the federal court. So with these two classifications, and the one thing I should add, certainly in terms of designated foreign nationals, and that's only the procedural limitations. On top of that, just in case you do happen to be a refugee and manage to prove it, you still don't get to be permanent resident for 5 years. Well, you know, you're working, etc., except guess who isn't here? Your family. So anybody who is a designated foreign national for 5 years, they don't see their family 5+ years because then you only apply. So there's this very punitive family separation. The reason I mention that is because the constitutional challenges to that will not just be procedural Section 7. I mean, because this is very punitive, we have to look at Section 15 issues and Section 10, which is the constitutional law preventing government from incarcerating people for arbitrary amounts of time. So all of that is going to be challenged. So that one particularly invites constitutional challenges. What I've tried to give you is a very brief summary of what could be legal strategies to a kind of legislative change that is quite shocking to a lot of the population. Gee, I can do better than that. Said 5 minutes. I'm not used to having more time. In any event, the challenge is this. I think from the point of view of lawyers, we think, wait a minute, this is a democracy. This is rule of law. How could it be that these kinds of really extraordinarily punitive actions have passed through our parliament? And there are many people in this room who testified before the Commons Committee, except for the one I mentioned in regard to the detention of designated foreign nationals. Originally, on their original bill, they wanted everybody, men, women, and children, to remain there for a year. So I suppose that's considered progress. But I think from our point of view, from rule of law, that it is just shocking that this has managed to go through our parliament, that the Canadian media and the Canadian population in general has not responded in a way to say this is unacceptable, and that hasn't happened. So we're confronted with this notion now that the next step is going to be in the courts. I think there's going to be a whole other media argument about that, but that somebody else can talk about that. For us, the next step will be two things. First of all, challenges in the courts in the way I've described on all three strategies. And as well of that, what we are going to have to do is we're going to have to keep track of the losses, of the damage, and the injury, because there are going to be a lot of injuries to refugee claimants, and we're then going to have to take, in a way, not our victories, but our losses, and we're going to have to put those before the Canadian public and challenge them and say, how can this happen in Canada? Thank you.
I just want to start by saying what a privilege it is for me to be actually on a panel with Peter and Mary Jo, who I think have been such strong advocates for refugees for so long. I was speaking to someone in the back there earlier and was in full panic because I realized my presentation is actually a PowerPoint presentation. And as I looked through the projector and things, I realized that I'm going to be winging this, so maybe I'll just pass this around. Mary Jo suggested she will do distracting visuals when necessary. So I am a family physician who's had the privilege of working with refugees for really the last 10 years. And most recently, most of my time has been at Women's College Hospital, where we've set up a refugee clinic that sees government-assisted refugees and refugee claimants. One day a week I work in a refugee shelter where we see newly arrived refugees, and that's the Christie Refugee Welcome Center. I was asked today to speak about the IFH cuts, and I realize there's a lot of people in this room who are probably better versed at the details of these cuts than perhaps I am. But I thought it might be interesting to just speak to you about really the optics of where we sit as physicians. And I'm going to start by just giving a basic overview of the cuts, and I think for those people who haven't had to deal with them, I find this incredibly complex, and there probably has not been a day that's gone by in the last 6 months where I don't spend half an hour to an hour discussing them. There's still things I don't fully understand about how these cuts are rolling out. So we'll go over the cuts. We'll talk a little bit about how different groups are being affected, and then what I'd like to perhaps speak to you about is what's really going on the ground. And the government keeps saying that all claimants will have access to healthcare at this point, at least until the DCO list comes out, but we have numerous examples to suggest that's not really what's happening. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the advocacy effort that's been taking place really from the point of view of healthcare workers. Perhaps a good place to start is to speak about what IFH was historically. So as most of you know, IFH really was based on an order in council that I think extends back to 1956 or 1957. From the point of view of a healthcare worker, it was simple. There were a lot of problems with IFH. There was a lot of rumblings over the years. So I'm sorry, it's the Interim Federal Health Program. It seems like such a well-versed audience. The Interim Federal Health Program, of course, is the federal government insurance that covers refugees, and it's been in place since 1957. It was fairly simple for physicians. People would come in with their IFH certificate, which is that brown paper with the picture on it, and we pretty much here in Ontario and the same other provinces would accept it as we would OHIP, right? So it gave people access to physician service, laboratory tests, diagnostic services. It also gave people access to the same basket of services that generally are provided to people who are on social assistance. So this is what the government's calling supplementary services, access to emergency dental care. And this isn't getting your teeth shiny or anything, it's really yanking teeth out. Emergency vision care, so being able to see an optometrist and coverage for glasses, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, assisted devices like prosthetics, midwifery care. So that basket of services, what the government keeps referring to supplementary care, is also provided by IFH. And I preface that by saying, again, this is pretty much the same package that low-income Canadians are getting across the country. Historically, people had always complained that it was difficult to bill IFH, it was hard to understand the system, but I think nevertheless, when the dust settled, most physicians understood what that coverage was about. They would accept it, the IFH would generally pay, and I think over the years there's been a lot of effort to make the process a bit more streamlined. So on April 25th or 26th, it was a Wednesday afternoon, the announcement came that there were going to be major changes to the Interim Federal Health Program. To understand these changes, as physicians, we had to understand the different groups of refugees, which we don't all quite understand. We had to understand the refugee trajectory. So again, healthcare coverage was going to be based on where you are in the refugee process. And then for many refugee groups, it was also going to depend on your diagnosis, which made it a bit problematic, because we often wouldn't know the diagnosis until we see people. But nevertheless, those were the sort of factors that came into play. And so how is this going to be played out? Well, let's look at each group of refugees. As many of you know, government-assisted refugees have now been taken off the table, and they're left with the same coverage they had before. It was the Friday before the long weekend when the cuts were going to take effect. So this was June 29th, and I was with some colleagues at a conference in Rochester, and we watched Minister Kenney give a press conference about 10 o'clock in the morning around, I can't remember what the issue was, but it was an immigration issue, and we were hoping he was going to talk about the cuts, and he did not. It was 4 o'clock that afternoon. He did an interview on CBC television suggesting there had been a misunderstanding, that the government-assisted refugees were never supposed to be on the table. People didn't quite understand that. And it was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night the website changed, suggesting now there was going to be a different package of services that was going to leave government-assisted refugees with the same coverage they had before. I mean, that's ridiculous, and I think the quote, we actually issued a press release the following Tuesday after the long weekend thanking the minister for capitulating to the pressure around his cuts of refugee insurance, but suggested that he should expand that to all refugee groups. The government kept suggesting that no, this wasn't a change, it was just a misunderstanding. As many of you know, those of you that work with government-assisted refugees, I mean, they had letters in hand saying their coverage was going to be cut off as of June 30th. The problem with that, and I think it's been one of the problems that's been insidious to this whole process, is that communication has been atrocious. So there's a well-documented case of a child in Hamilton who stopped taking their anti-seizure medication because they had thought they didn't have access to medication after June 30th, right? This happened very quietly on a Friday of a long weekend. The child was hospitalized with recurrence of seizures. So it was great they were taken off the table. The process, I think, as we look back on it, was not one that really was as transparent as it should be. Nevertheless, as it stands now, we commend the government for backing off on government-assisted refugees. For privately sponsored refugees, they generally will have provincial health coverage when they're here. What they are losing is that package of services called the supplementary health services. They no longer have access to dental care. They don't have access to medications. I think the problem that we're seeing, and I don't see a lot of privately sponsored refugees, is that people will be landing with undiagnosed illness. We've had cases over the years where people have come with significant renal failure and required medications. It sometimes costs tens of thousands of dollars a year. And inevitably this will happen if it hasn't already. So most of my practice in the last year has been dealing with refugee claimants, and as many of you know, the process in which refugee claimants will get their health insurance is really going to be dependent on whether they come from a country that's on the designated country list or not. So if you're not coming from one of the countries that will be designated, and the list we're anticipating will come out sometime in the next month or so, you have the same coverage as people with provincial health plans, but again, you lose your supplementary services. There's no access to medications. If you need a prosthetic because you've had an amputation in the past, you're not covered. If your children need dental care, you're not covered. Okay, we'll get back to that. If you come from a country which is on the designated country of origin list, you pretty much will have no health care coverage. Right? And there's a government document that was circulated when the cuts were announced, which has disappeared from their website. We have copies of it, which goes through a list of 12 eclectic conditions from rheumatoid arthritis to TB to pregnancy to heart attacks, and what coverage you would get based on what particular refugee class you're in. If you're from a DCO country, and it's quite clearly laid out, if you have a heart attack, you have no coverage. If your child has a fever or malaria, you have no coverage. If you're suicidal, you have no coverage. If you're pregnant, you will have no coverage. The only thing that will be covered, and the government has spoken to this quite frequently, is that you will have coverage for issues of public health and public security significance. And that sounds fantastic. But when you break it down, I think our definition of public health and public security as physicians is quite different from what the government is proposing. So let's tease that out a bit. What is an issue of public health significance? We're supposed to refer to a list that's produced by the Public Health Agency of Canada of 50 notifiable diseases. So we'll all be happy to know things like anthrax and botulism and mad cow disease will have coverage, right? I've never seen a case. There are things on that list that are relevant. So hepatitis and chlamydia and gonorrhea and HIV is on that list. Nevertheless, we often as physicians see syndromes. So when you come and see me and have a pneumonia, I can't tell you the organism that's causing it, and we treat based on that. And we've run into problems already working through this public health coverage. So it is a very confined list. Public health sounds broad, but it is not. It has to be one of these 50 diagnoses. Public security coverage is even tighter. So the only thing that will be covered under public security is if a physician has certified you to be a risk to others. So if you are on the Bloor Viaduct about to jump, you will not have any coverage. You will not have coverage for medications. You will not have coverage for your hospitalization. Right? And it's quite clear, we have this in writing. This is public security coverage. So it is very, very limited, and I think it's safe to say in most cases, people who come from DCO countries are essentially going to be out in the dark. Right? They will not have health care for the majority of things that they're presenting with, and this will be a catastrophe. One of the other things that we're noticing, and this really doesn't speak to changes that are in the Order in Council, but occurred around the same time, and there are lawyers here who can probably speak to this more eloquently than I can. We're noticing inland claimants aren't given temporary IFH coverage until the point where they have their first meeting with an immigration officer. And it took us a while to figure this out, but what that means, at the shelter I work at, we've seen kids arrive with fevers from malaria areas. One day I walked into work at the shelter, and it's fairly laid back when I got in there. And on this particular day, there was a 69-year-old woman lying on the floor with all the shelter staff looking over her. She had just arrived from the Congo. She had arrived with fever and abdominal pain, which is, the list of things that cause it is quite long. And she had absolutely no health care coverage. And we're seeing this over and over and over again. We're seeing kids with asthma that we can't treat. We just had a kid last week who had a pneumonia. We couldn't get a chest x-ray. In Toronto, it's taking 4 to 6 weeks for that IFH coverage to be initiated. During that period of time, they have no coverage. So if you have tuberculosis, no coverage, right? And shelter staff has brought this up because not only is that a risk to the clients, but it's also a risk to the people who are taking care of them. And this is a story that I don't think has been publicized as well as it should be. We had the opportunity of bringing in the Director General of the Health Branch of CIC to speak to us a couple of months ago, Dr. Gondan. It's her signature on the Order in Council. And we brought up that issue, and her response was actually quite interesting. She said, inland claimants, these are people who've been here a long time. They came on their student visa, work visa, and didn't want to go back home. So the wait a month really shouldn't be a big problem. We certainly in the shelter are seeing people coming from places. They come through the airport and make their claim the next day in Etobicoke. So this is something that wasn't in the Order Council, but it's creating tremendous hardship for new arrivals. So, what has been the government response when we've asked about why the cut? So, as most of you remember, when they made the announcement, they talked about a saving of $100 million over 5 years. We have asked repeatedly for them to share that analysis, and it hasn't come. I think for most of us, it's not a huge leap of faith to recognize that this program is going to be more costly than it saves. We know that when you can't treat a diabetic because they don't have care, they end up in emergency rooms, right? And it is much more complicated to treat. We know that if you see a pneumonia by the time someone needs oxygen or ends up needing an ICU admission, that is expensive. If women aren't getting prenatal care, if kids aren't checking in for their well-child visits, this is expensive care. And granted, it might not be picked up by the feds, this might be picked up by provincial plans, but I think the argument that the taxpayer is saving money is an absolute fallacy, and we question where that data is coming from. Even if their numbers are right, $20 million is a tremendous amount of money. In the context of healthcare budgets where we really speak in tens of billions, it's minuscule. The second argument they've given, and they really have moved away from the cost argument we had noticed, was the idea of equity. The notion that refugees are getting gold-plated health care, that they're getting much more than the average Canadians get. I think where they've landed on is that package of supplementary services. We know the person in the corner store out here doesn't have access to dental insurance or doesn't have access to seeing an optometrist without paying for it. Nevertheless, if you're comparing apples to apples, what we're talking about is low-income Canadians, and I've seen probably 2,000 refugees. I know it's tremendous experience in this room. I can't recall the last time I saw someone who was in a position where they could afford dental care. So if we're comparing apples to apples, really low-income Canadians in this country have very much the same package as refugees were receiving before the changes on June 30th. And it's actually documented on the CIC website. If you go to the CIC website and look at the health coverage that's in place now for government-assisted refugees, which is the same as the coverage that applied to everyone previous to June 30th, it quite clearly says this is exactly what other low-income Canadians are getting through provincial health plans. The third excuse, and we heard this very briefly, was that, refugees get an immigrant health exam before they come. And that's just as good as a full physical. And we know that's absolutely absurd. I think Kenny is getting really poor advice when he's making statements like that. When someone comes in for an immigrant health exam, it really is to look for something that's costly. It's to look for issues that might be of public health concern. But we don't screen for diabetes or TB or hepatitis, issues that I think are quite relevant in this population. Finally, what we're noticing in the last couple of weeks, perhaps in the last 10 days, is they're making a distinction between refugee claimants and refugees. And this is really after the case we heard about in Saskatchewan last week, where Kenny, it's hard to say his name, where Kenny has come out and suggested that they are not true refugees until they have gone through the RRB hearing. And there's a number of ways I think we will approach that, but that seems to be an argument that the government is settling on. Finally, what they've said is that everyone has public health and public security coverage, and again, we've talked about it. I think it's a bit of a fallacy. I just want to spend the last few minutes talking about the response from healthcare workers. I think, if there's been anything redeeming about this process, it's really been to see colleagues of ours across the country stand up in ways that I think were unimaginable 6 months ago. So I can tell you that So it was that Wednesday, I think the cuts were announced, and I sent out an email to some colleagues, and it was Phil Berger, that some of you might know. He's a physician who's done a lot of work with HIV, and really was one of the first family doctors working with HIV, going back into the 1980s. And he called me the next night. I didn't know Phil very well at that point, but he called me and said, "Ma'am, I've got an idea." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, it worked in the 70s. And I thought, okay. He's a bit older. And he said, "We're going to go occupy a federal government building." And I said, "Right, who is this?" And we thought about this, and we realized that we wanted to keep the issue alive in the press. And when was the last time you saw a group of doctors occupying a federal government building for something outside of our own interests? And I have a great picture on the PowerPoint. Perhaps I'll share tomorrow at the talk we're doing on the IFH cuts. We were hoping to get 12 physicians. We decided to go into Joe Oliver's office, who was the highest ranking Tory minister in Toronto, and we ended up getting 90. It was phenomenal. And, It was actually really hard to coordinate, and we had 4 groups coming from different sides. It became much more complicated, and we didn't get a long time in his room, but you could see when the police came, they were a bit baffled. They couldn't, and we were all in lab coats, and they couldn't hit us, I don't think, because we could shoot ourselves. But anyway, we went on from there to have a national day of action. We had 14 cities involved and thousands of people across the country. Everywhere from coast to coast to coast. We actually had a very small demonstration in Inuvik at the post office, we were told. But since then, we've decided to focus our energy really on making some of the cases we're seeing public. And this is where I'm really going to ask for your help. It's become clear to us around a couple of cases that have hit the media. One was quite a brave man, Daniel Garcia, who needed surgery. And the ophthalmologist actually did this surgery for free at St. Michael's Hospital down the street. And he was brave enough to do an interview with the Toronto Star. And it was a couple of days after that, there was a strong editorial in the Star. And I think it was the Globe and Mail or the National Post, I can't recall. And of course the case last week that really incited Premier Wall of Saskatchewan to make very strong statements. And it was followed again by an editorial in the Toronto Star and a very strong article in the National Post. And so we've become quite convinced that really, if we're going to keep this issue alive in the media and hopefully be able to obtain public support, to put some pressure on political representatives, it really has to be in the media. And what we're hearing from our colleagues in the media is we've heard from the doctors, we've heard from the lawyers, we need to hear from refugees. We have had the hardest time getting refugees to speak up, and I know for many of the lawyers in the room, your advice to people would likely be not to put themselves out there. And we understand that. We are trying every month or so to issue a press release that will identify cases where we're doing it anonymously and not even country of origin names. So I know that there's a number of you out there who have connections, who have cases. We'd encourage you to let us know. Just one very quick point on Bill C-31. I saw Janet Cleveland come in, who I think is probably the top health researcher on mandatory detention. We've, in this country, and she can certainly speak more eloquently to the health impacts of some of the issues of Bill C-31. I can just say there's a number of small studies that have come out of Australia, some out of the United States, some out of Europe. It's quite clear, they're not huge studies, but they show the same patterns. There's at least a 3 times increased risk in post-traumatic stress disorder depression in people who are incarcerated. That rate is much higher in children. It seems to be associated with the length of detention. Clearly there are health impacts for many facets of what's in Bill C-31, and it's something that we're going to speak about as we move forward. I had great pictures on my PowerPoint, but anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Somewhere in this city, there is a young man called David. He owns a contracting company, and one of his employees is from Sri Lanka. As they worked together, David discovered that this young man from Sri Lanka could be deported. And over a period of time, David talked to this young man. He did his own homework, he did his research, he studied the refugee system. And he's worried because he knows that this young man's life is at great risk. And so he asked to meet with the small sanctuary group that meets weekly in Toronto. And he basically said, if worse comes to worse, could this young man find sanctuary? Somewhere in this city, there is also a group of elderly priests who for almost a year have shared their space, their chapel, with the Roma family. They are in sanctuary. Somewhere in the city, a church is meeting, often, about whether or not to offer sanctuary. Somewhere in this city, there is a synagogue talking about sanctuary. And so this very ancient tradition is here, is now, is growing. It is being discussed very seriously because we must. Because as Peter said, Bill C-31 is not fair. And it has disastrous implications for some people. I've been involved in the sanctuary movement for more than 20 years now with Michael Creel. It's an astonishing movement. All over the country, here and there, occasionally, sometimes frequently, sometimes not, a church opens its doors to a refugee whose life is in danger. Protestant, Catholic, middle class, social justice-oriented churches. And in every case, it's because the members of that church have heard a particular story, and they have seen people face to face, and they have heard this ethical plea. And they know that a human life is at stake, a family's security is at stake. Over these 20 years, almost all those cases in sanctuary have been resolved, one way or the other. And it's not a movement that has been organized from on high. This has emerged entirely on a local church by local church basis. It is a movement, a spontaneous movement of conscience, and it is weighty, consequential, and significant. Now, several years ago, I had the rather dubious honor of accompanying the church leaders to a meeting with Judy Scrow, the then Minister of Immigration. And she had heard that there were some instances of sanctuary in the country, and she didn't like that. And so she called a meeting of the church leaders and basically said, we can resolve these things quietly. And so she said, it's embarrassing. I mean, really. And she said, look, what we'll do is if you just give me a list of about 20 cases every year, we'll take care of it. And the church leaders, to their great credit, and I was a witness to this, they said two things. One was, we will never do an option. We will never take an option that is not open to every other NGO that works with refugees. And secondly, they said, we did not start this movement. It started from below, from the local level as a movement of conscience, and we will not stop it. We will never take sanctuary off the table because it is part of our tradition. It is our right. And I believe they were talking about freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. Sanctuary in the churches, in religious groups, is based on a double affirmation. And the first is that there are some spaces like this one that are holy and that are sacred and that are beyond the reach of the state. And the second affirmation is that human beings are sacred, that their lives are sacred and worthy of our finest efforts at justice. They are not meant to be shoveled off and shipped out of this country. We foresee, and we told the government this when Bill C-31 was being developed, that there will be an increase in requests for sanctuary, that there is already happening. This is happening now. And I say with certainty that the need for sanctuary will only grow until we address the lack of fairness in Bill C-31. And so we are organizing. Effectively, we are trying to organize a national sanctuary network. We have had meetings, we now have a website, we are in communication, we are shamelessly promoting sanctuary wherever we can, and we will do so. We will do so with great conviction. We will continue to advocate for change until sanctuary is no longer necessary. We will do this because we can and because we must. We must do this not only for the refugees whom we know personally. We must do this for our country. And I would say to our political leaders, Mr. Prime Minister, members of Parliament who voted for Bill C-31, some may say that you have sold us out. I think it would be more true to say that you have sold this country short. We are more than taxpayers. We are citizens, and we are not only interested in our lifestyles, we are interested in lives and committed to justice. We are quite capable of thinking about more than ourselves. We can care about other people. We can be generous. We are much better than you think. We are a better country than you have voted for. We are a people who care. We are decent and we are capable of goodness.